Let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Particularly good morning and welcome to members of the news media, to education leaders, policymakers. We have a lot of different folks on the call today who span a lot of different parts of our system. We're really excited today to talk with you about Getting Down to Facts 2, which is an in-depth status report on California's pre-K-12 education system. I am Dr. Heather Huff. I'm the Executive Director of PACE, Policy Analysis for California Education, with Susanna Loeb at Stanford University. Today, we all release Getting Down to Facts 2, 10 years after the release of the first Getting Down to Facts report in 2007. The research that we'll present today was really a collaborative effort. It's the result of nearly 2 years of work in partnership with over 100 of the nation's top researchers, many of whom are on the call today. In the time that we have with you today, we're going to provide an overview of the main findings, the importance of the research, and then we'll have a lot of time for question and answers. While our presenters are talking, what you can do is type your questions into the Zoom question and answer link, and we're gonna make sure that we answer them. If we don't get to your question, at the end of the presentation, we will respond to folks that were on the call with answers, but we're gonna try to get to all of your questions. So without further ado, let's answer this question. How exactly is California's education system doing? The short answer is California's pre-K-12 education system is moving in the right direction, but we still have a long way to go. We have an election this fall that will dictate the governance and leadership of the state. And the report that we're releasing today and the set of studies that undergird it contain the facts that policymakers need to determine what's next for California schools and students. And as we all know, there's a lot at stake. Our state educates 6.2 million students, which is 12% of the US population. So what we do matters, not just here in California, but nationwide. The decisions that our leaders are going to make in the months ahead will have huge implications for all of us. In a moment, you're going to hear from Susanna Loeb, who's the principal investigator for Getting Down to Facts. Susanna was formerly with Stanford University and now the director of the Annenberg Institute at Brown University. Dr. Loeb will be available to answer questions after her presentation, and we have a lot of researchers who are on the line who are going to be able to answer questions as well. We have Drs. Christopher Edley Jr., Linda Darling-Hammond, Jennifer Emezeki, Deborah Stipek, Lucrecia Santabanez, Corey Codell, and Julie Marsh. And we'll talk a bit about their areas of expertise before we open it up for questions. But first, just an overview about what Getting Down to Facts 2 is. It's a national collaborative research project on California's pre-K-12 education system. It is comprised of 36 research studies, 19 research briefs, and more than 100 researchers from universities and research organizations across the country. And it is an important sequel to the first Getting Down to Facts project, which was released 10 years ago in 2007 and led to some pretty significant changes as a result. Okay, so I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Susanna Loeb, who is going to give an overview of the Getting Down to Facts 2 findings. Susanna. Susanna, we can't hear you yet.
Thank you, Heather. Hello, I'm Susanna Loeb, and I'm the director of the Annenberg Institute at Brown University, and I've been the principal investigator for both this project, Getting Down to Facts 2, and for the preceding 2007 project, Getting Down to Facts. So let's start with the big picture. What did we find? Well, we found that over the last decade, California made positive strides in public education, particularly by advancing K-12 academic standards and by adopting a new funding model. However, our research finds that historic student achievement gaps persist and significant improvements are needed to support student success. So what specifically did our investigators examine and what did they find? We divided the research into 4 main categories: student success, governance, personnel, and funding or finance. During the past decade, California has undergone tremendous shifts, including changing funding allocations under the local control funding formula and introducing a new accountability system, new standards, and new performance metrics. We found that these reforms have resulted in improvements and that there is wide support among both educators and the public for these changes. However, our research also has shown that there is a lot of work to do to realize the full potential of these reforms and to address other issues that have not yet been taken up. Specifically, there are three areas to focus on. The first is building on current reforms. The system still needs capacity building. That is, we need to ensure that educators and other practitioners have the skills, information, and materials that they need to make use of the new opportunities and put these major reforms into practice. Second, we need to address achievement gaps. Large achievement gaps by race, ethnicity, income, and English learner status persist in California and need a continued focus through multiple approaches, including enhanced early childhood education. Third, the research finds supports for increasing funding and fixing flaws in the finance system. Funding for schools in California has increased, but it remains short of adequate levels given the ambitious goals that the state has set out. Moreover, funding reforms left critical issues unresolved. Pensions and special education funding in particular, but also facilities, each have the potential to destabilize the system or worsen inequalities if we do not address them. So let's take a closer look at how reforms put into place over the last decade are doing. Consider first building on current reforms. California students are performing better than ever. On national assessments, the state students have been performing better over time and have been increasing at a faster rate than the rest of the nation. However, the research shows that California still lags the nation in achievement in reading and math. Even when accounting for income and racial ethnic differences, we have striking achievement gaps. The reforms that have been put into place over the past 10 years have broad buy-in, but the research finds that additional support is needed to fully realize their potential. This holds true for areas of funding reform, standards reform, and investments in information systems. We see a consistent story of improvement, but that California continues to fall short of realizing the potential of the new systems because of serious capacity limitation. First, in the area of finance, initial research provides evidence that the local control funding formula, LCFF, induced increases in school spending that in turn led to increases in high school graduation rates and academic achievement, particularly among low-income and minority students. A $1,000 increase in district per pupil spending experienced in grades 10 through 12 was estimated to lead to a 5.9 percentage point increase in high school graduation rates. However, some districts struggle with how to allocate resources effectively given their new flexibility, and a large group of districts do not have access to necessary supports to build the knowledge and skills that they need to use resources effectively. In terms of standards, our research found that the new standards have broad local buy-in again, and teachers and principals report increased help with instructional improvement and improved alignment of these supports with the standards. However, educators also report difficulty assessing the quality of the available materials and of other resources, and difficulty selecting the best options available. Many superintendents look to the state for help and information, but the California Department of Education does not have the capacity to reliably support the improvement of instruction, given the small staff devoted to instructional improvement and low salaries relative to other public positions. Finally, in terms of information, the state data system is now richer than it was, including information on student learning over time and mobility of students across districts. This information could allow for better informed decision-making. However, access to the data is severely limited, and there's still significant gaps in the data themselves. For example, there's little early childhood information, and the K through 12 system doesn't link easily to higher education data, so that we can't learn about the long run effects of policies and practices. Moreover, the CDE, the Department of Education, does not have the capacity to use the data effectively to guide policy decisions. So the reforms have created the start of good systems, but they need capacity building for the systems to be effective in practice. So next, we found a need to increase funding and fix finance systems across the board. We see increases over the past 10 years in funding for schools. California school district expenditure levels have not only recovered from their post-recession lows, but also reached higher levels in 2016-17 than at any point since 2004-2005. However, the research also provides evidence that the funding remains inadequate to reach the state's ambitious goals for students. The average school revenue per pupil in California is substantially above Florida. It's about on par with Texas and Ohio, but lower than Illinois and substantially lower than many northeastern states, including New York. However, at least in part due to the higher cost of living and the wages of college graduates in California, average teacher salaries are higher in California than in these comparison states, except for in New York. The relatively low funding level combined with high salaries has resulted in California having far fewer adults in schools than most other states. Just as one example, California ranks at or near the bottom of all states in the percentage of K-12 public school students with access to various types of healthcare or mental health services inside their school buildings. Prior research studies have linked these services to better child outcomes, reduced emergency department usage, higher educational success, and low teen birth rates. So there's a reason to think that not having them is problematic. While estimating the exact funding needed to reach the state's ambitious goals is difficult, we needed to come at it from multiple angles. One of the Getting Down to Facts studies drew on professional judgment to identify the necessary resources to reach these goals, and they estimate that an additional 32% of actual spending would be necessary for all students to have the opportunity to meet the goals set by the State Board of Education. On a per pupil basis, that would average around $16,800 per student in school district cost. That compares with actual California district spending of about $12,750 per student in the year they did the study, so about a year ago. A big increase would be required as estimated by this study, but I just wanted to note that that's still below the spending in a number of states, particularly in the Northeast. In addition to identifying the need for increased spending, the Getting Down to Facts study showed that the LCFF funding reforms left critical issues unresolved. Pensions and special education in particular each have the potential to destabilize the system or to worsen inequalities. The pension system is drawing substantial funds away from schools' operating expenditures. Past contributions were not nearly enough to cover the costs, and these have resulted in substantial increases in the contributions required by teachers, schools, districts, and the state today. Without intervention, this drain on the system resources will continue to expand, requiring expenditures approximately equal to 1/3 of teacher salaries by 2021. And that would be spending that doesn't go into the classroom. LCFF also did not change special education finance in California, which can be unpredictable and draining for districts. The Getting Down to Facts 2 researchers interviewed approximately 50 chief budget officers from a randomly chosen set of school districts, and all of the CBOs identified special education funding as one of their 3 biggest concerns. Similarly, LCFF did not address facilities funding, and our project found that California has wide disparities in school facility funding that are systematically related to school district property wealth. And these are driven in part by California's school facility program, which operates on a first-come, first-served basis, and as a result favors wealthier and larger districts that are better positioned to provide the required matching funds. So California funding has definitely increased with benefits for students, but the level of funding is still likely substantially short of what is needed to meet state goals, and issues of pensions, special education funding, and facilities funding remain pressing. Finally, we should turn to California's achievement gaps. Large achievement gaps by race, ethnicity, income, and English learner status persist in California and need a continued focus through multiple approaches, including enhanced early childhood education. California has greater disparities among student groups than do other states. In more affluent California districts, student achievement levels are similar to the average performance in affluent districts nationally. But students in non-affluent districts score on average nearly a full grade level behind their national counterparts. At least part of these inequalities stem from unequal education in K-12 schools. For example, schools serving less advantaged students tend to have more difficulty filling teaching positions, and as a result, employ fewer experienced as well as fewer appropriately credentialed teachers and principals. Moreover, many English learners in California do not have equitable access to grade-level core content instruction, partly because ELs may be tracked into lower-level content areas, and because English language development classes often crowd out content instruction. However, not all of the evident achievement gaps are due to K-12 schools. The learning rates in California's third through eighth grade students are about the same, or actually slightly better than students nationwide. However, low-income students in California lag behind their national counterparts at kindergarten entry. The early childhood education system in California is not providing the opportunities that students enter school on an equal footing. Black and Latino children and dual language learners are less likely to have attended preschool than are white children. Children from low-income families are more likely to have childcare that is license exempt, not having to meet the quality standards of licensed care. Childcare workers in California receive low wages and benefits. In fact, 58% depend on at least one public income support. The early childhood education system has little oversight in California and little emphasis on quality. A policy push to reduce achievement gaps is pressing in California, and improving early childhood education is likely a necessary feature of any effective reform approach. So overall, there is a lot good going on in California. Nonetheless, Getting Down to Facts has identified the need for further capacity building to realize the benefits of the recent reforms, including investments in the comprehensiveness and use of information systems, the need for increased funding levels, the need to address pensions and special education finance, and a need to address achievement gaps head-on. I'd like to turn you now to Dr. Christopher Edley Jr., who is the president and co-founder of the Opportunity Institute and a distinguished professor of law at UC Berkeley, for his insights on the project and our results.
Thanks, Susanna. That was amazing. I don't have a whole lot to add. Heather, if you can put up my first slide, please. Yeah, bingo. All right. So this is just a quick way, I think, of trying to underscore something that Heather was saying about the state of the disparities and comparing the disparities in California with those across the nation. Only 3 states are worse than California in looking at 8th grade reading scores as compared with the national average. In 2007. But in 2017, that number had grown to 14 states. Looking at so California as a whole in comparison with the nation has been improving in the sense that there are more states that are worse than we are, but only 14 of them. If you look at Hispanic white disparities, first look at how big is the disparity in California. Only 8 states had Hispanic white disparities that were greater than California's. And that number had declined to, that number had declined to 4 states that were worse than California. So we're moving backwards in that respect. Next slide, please. All right, here it is in graphical form. On the left, the gray line is looking at the Latino white gap in California. And you can see it remains at 27 scale score points in the 8th grade NAEP reading test, as compared with the Latino white gap overall, which is 20%. But the important thing here is that over time, in the last 10 years, the national gap, Latino versus white, has been declining, whereas California's was down slightly, but has returned to the unfortunate levels of 2017. You can look at the graph on the right to see a similar thing. At the bottom, we see that California has narrowed its gap with the national average as a whole for all students. But with respect to these racial disparities on top, the progress is much more limited. The only other points I want to underscore are that the big surprise for me in the research studies, I think, was the substantial effect that both pension crises and infrastructure crises, buildings and facilities, are going to crowd out spending in the operating budgets of school districts. And these poor and minority kids are likely to feel that disproportionately. Stated a different way, the education equity community, both policymakers and advocates, need to pay attention to the pension crisis and be at the table when the solutions are being developed. Finally, I want to point out that the reforms of LCFF and the local control action plans is really a hypothesis. It's a hope on the part of folks in Sacramento and elsewhere that devolution of responsibility combined with local participation in policymaking would result in more equitable outcomes. At this stage, as Julie Marsh's paper points out and some of the other research papers, at this stage, those hypotheses about devolution and local control and local participation are unproven. We don't know yet whether this experiment will work in terms of improving outcomes and narrowing our disparities. So that is the huge thing to look at in the near future, to see what happens with public participation, to see if the policy choices being made at the local level have a reasonable shot at narrowing the disparities that at this point remain unacceptably high. That's it. Heather?
Great, thank you so much, Chris. Excuse me, thank you so much for providing that overview and the call to action. We really appreciate that. So I hope that all of you on the line have gotten a flavor for the overview and the moral imperatives for this work. And what we want to do now is open it up to the experts that we have on the line so that we can ask them to speak a little bit more in depth about their area of expertise. So thank you to those of you that have already put questions into the question and answer box. Please, for the rest of you, please, that have questions, go ahead and put them in there as we're having a conversation. I'll ask the panelists to turn on their videos now while I give a brief overview of each person and the expertise that they bring to the table. So you all were introduced to Dr. Susanna Loeb. She can speak to the overall findings, but also has deep expertise in the areas of teacher quality, data use, and many other things. I am the executive director of PACE and your tour guide for today, but I also wrote papers on data and continuous improvement, and so I can answer questions in that domain. Dr. Edley, it can talk about equity and also wrote a summary paper that covers all of these topics, so he can bring that perspective to the answers. Dr. Darling Hammond is an expert on California's teacher workforce and can speak to that. Dr. Emma Zecki is an expert on finance. Dr. Deborah Stipek can speak to all of the issues around early childhood education. Dr. Santibanez specializes in English learners policy and with a particular focus on teaching. Dr. Corey Codell is our resident pension expert. And finally, Dr. Julie Marsh is our expert on the line who can speak to the implementation of the local control funding formula, including kind of local standards implementation and stakeholder engagement. So let's open it up first to a question for Dr. Stipek. And I'm hoping that all of you are off mute and on your videos. So Dr. Stipek, could you talk a bit about, Susanna discussed the importance of early childhood education, the gaps that we see at kinder. Could you elaborate a bit more on California's current early childhood system and what some of the challenges are in that area?
I'd be happy to. California, not too many decades ago, was a leader in the nation on early childhood education, and unfortunately, over the last few decades, it's fallen substantially behind other states. There's an echo. Is it coming through clear on your side?
No, I'm hearing the echo too. Could all of the panelists please mute when you're not speaking? Thank you.
So there are a number of ways we've fallen behind. One is in access. There are many young children in the state who really don't have access to any care, let alone quality care. This is a particular problem for infants and toddlers. And I think it's not just a problem for low-income families, although the affordability is a serious issue. It's a problem for many families because fewer and fewer people are going into being providers for childcare. Part of the reason is that the reimbursement rates are too low and that the standards are highly variable. As Susanna mentioned, over half of the people who provide childcare are eligible for some kind of state or federal subsidy or support or assistance. That tells you something about the salaries that are paid to people who are in the field of early childhood education. In addition to low salaries, they're very unlikely to have any kind of benefits. So in a situation where we have low unemployment, we have very few people going into the field, which is causing some very severe shortages. Standards vary hugely from depending on whether a program is federal or state, or even within the state, there are many different sets of standards depending on the funding source. Some are sort of okay, most are pretty bad, and we have a very high proportion in the state of California of children who are in what's called license exempt care, which means there are no standards whatsoever. There have been some really important efforts, I think, to try to improve quality through our QRAS system, but there's no incentive for programs to participate, and so only a little bit over a fourth of California early childhood programs actually participate in the quality improvement programs. I could go on. Those are a few, I think, of the more serious problems. We also really need to increase the training demands for people who go into the field. California now is lagging way behind most states in what is required for people to begin in the field. the problem is if we increase the training requirements, we're going to have an even greater shortage of people going into the field. So without increased pay and benefits, we can't do any of these individually. I'm going to stop there, but the report will go into much more detail.
Great. Thank you so much, Deborah. We have another question for Linda Darling-Hammond. The question really is that teachers seem to be the key for implementing all of these reforms. How is California managing in terms of teacher shortages? Are we moving in the right direction? Are the shortages getting worse? And also, how should we think about teacher quality as a variable in the mix?
Well, as the question suggests, teacher quality is a huge variable in the mix, and as is principal quality. And we documented severe shortages of teachers and growing shortages of principals in a couple of the personnel papers associated with this project. And those shortages have been growing since about 2015. They're obviously most severe in math and science. Special education, there's a growing shortage in bilingual education because of the fact that the propositions passed last November included one that opened up the legality of bilingual education programs again. The state has put recent resources towards building the pipeline for teacher shortages. It seems to be primarily a function of dramatic declines in the number of people going into teacher education and then coming in and being licensed in the state. But there's also a high attrition rate in California, about 8.5%, and a much higher attrition rate, about double that, for people who come into teaching on emergency permits. And so that creates a kind of a churn. If half the people coming in are underprepared then and leaving quickly, we're not going to catch up. So the programs that are currently on the docket from the legislature include some pathways in that are intended to be high retention pathways for paraprofessionals, for teacher residency models that serve career changers or those coming out of bachelor's degrees, and for retooling the workforce in the case of bilingual education as well. Right now, those have only made a tiny dent in a small upswing in capacity and entrance to the profession. The direction is beginning to be the right direction, but there's still an enormous gap. So that's clearly going to be part of the capacity moving forward, and particularly with new standards in English language arts, math, and science. When you have a huge shortage of math and science teachers, when about 40% of those coming in have not been prepared, it's going to be very hard to meet the new standards without continued investments in that area, and hopefully some success from the most recent investments that have not yet been put into implementation.
Thank you, Linda. So we have a couple of follow-up questions to that kind of bring in some of our other presenters. So first, Dr. Codell, could you talk a bit about pensions and what the big picture is there? And the question that ties into teachers is, how do we think about the problem that we have with pensions in the context of the challenge we have around teacher shortages? And could those two things have a relationship that, you know, if we fix the pension problem, do we make the teacher shortage worse, is the nature of the question. So Dr. Codell, could you talk first about the pension situation, and then perhaps Linda, you can weigh in with the implications for workforce.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, so the pension issue, essentially the pension system, for a couple of big reasons, but probably a bunch of small ones too, has accumulated a bunch of debt over the last 10 to 15 years. And so the California introduced legislation to try to fix this problem. And that basically involves paying down all of that debt. And the way the pension system works is that all falls back on the system. So school districts' costs are going up a lot. The state's costs are going up quite a bit as well. Teachers are also paying a little bit more for their pensions. And the current projections are that these new higher rates that Susanna briefly mentioned, which are going to push pension costs a little above 35% of teacher salaries, is the current projection that we're going to need that level of payment through 2046. So, and there's reasons that might even be too optimistic. So this is a really long-term problem, and it is taking a lot of resources. Whether fixing the pension, the suggestion that fixing the pension problem might make teacher shortages worse, I'm not so sure about. I actually feel like fixing the pension system could help. It depends on how it's done. But because a lot of this debt is going to, so school districts, their contributions went from 8.25% of teacher salaries in 2014, and they're going to be over 19% of teacher salaries in 2021. So those are resources the schools could use for teacher compensation, direct compensation, if they weren't, stop paying down pension debt. I should also make clear pension benefits aren't improving with these cost increases. This is just to pay previous debt. So I think if there were smart reforms of the pension plan, it could actually free up resources, which I would hope could help recruit more teachers.
Thanks, Linda. Would you like to add on to that?
Well, I think that Corey is making a good point that fixing the pension system in the long run is really going to be important to be able to put resources where we need them for recruiting and retaining teachers otherwise. For example, we know that keeping beginning teachers requires investments in mentoring and induction programs. Those have been squeezed in recent years, but a well-mentored teacher is likely to stay at twice the rate of a poorly mentored teacher, and that can make a difference in solving the shortages. If you're spending your money on, the pension liabilities, you may not be spending it in some of the other areas where the investments are needed.
Thank you. So we have another question now that I think is best directed to Dr. Julie Marsh. This question is about how to think about the state's emerging system of support with regards to some of the system capacity challenges that Susanna mentioned in her overview comments. So really, how do we leverage that developing system to support capacity building at the local level and build capacity at the state level? Or what is the evidence from our studies about the current state of implementation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think our studies have occurred at the infancy of the development of that system, so I'm not sure we have a lot of evidence about how it's working, because again, it's just getting off the ground. But I do think that several of the studies here do speak to some of the growing role, for example, of the county offices of education and the limited and variation in the capacity of the county offices. And that came out clearly in several of the papers. And so if we're thinking about the county along with the CCEE and the state as trying to help districts that are identified as low performing on the new dashboard, I think there's evidence that suggests we need more investment in these organizations that are supposed to be supporting all these districts. So in particular, for example, we see variation across the state. We see big differences between rural and non-rural districts and their access to support. I think we need to think about support as being very different for large urbans and these rural or small town districts. And I think the evidence is showing there's a lot of concern about the kind of variation in the limited resources that are also being pulled apart. If we think about county offices as both approving and trying to help districts with their LCAPs, in many cases we were finding that there's research that shows that they're pulling people off of then work to support standards implementation and other kinds of reforms that are important in schools to try and do these new roles that they're being called on to do with regard to LCFF. So there's a strain here and big needs. I'm not sure we have the answers, but we certainly believe that this new system of support is going to be critical for ensuring the success of a lot of the reforms we're talking about today.
Great,
I'll
thank
just
you,
jump
Julie.
in and add, Heather, that,
Yeah.
One of the principal responses by the state to this capacity problem is the California Collaborative on Education Excellence. But that office is woefully underfunded, so that its ability to help the county with advice, with resources, is all but non-existent in my view, and triple that concern when it applies to specifically to districts. But the second thing is that the California Collaborative is focused on jurisdictions that volunteer to receive help and to participate in learning networks with each other. And those who volunteer may not be the jurisdictions that need the most support.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chris, and it dovetails with a question from one of our attendees. We've talked a lot about some of the challenges and the variation, but this is a question for all of the panelists. In your research, did you identify areas for promising practice or places where districts and schools were really doing great work to innovate around solving some of these problems?
Let me just take that for the project overall. I mean, I think there's a lot of good things going on in California, and decentralization in some ways leads to that. There's a lot of variation, and I just wanted to reiterate something Chris said about this variation and that there's some places that are really taking on the new standards and the new assessments and building instructional capacities very well. There's some districts that are taking on the allocation of resources, and they're bringing in their local communities, and they're allocating resources in a way that benefits students, particularly students in need. The real question is what's happening in places where that isn't going on, and how do we make sure that we can support those places to transform. And I mean, I think one element that came out clearly is that we need better evidence about where this is happening, where different things are happening. If we're going to have a system where people have lots of local control, the responsibility of the state, which they bring down to the districts or to the counties in some ways, is to see if there are places that are falling off and try to build those supports there. So I think that's really the role of the state, is to try to figure out where the places are that need additional supports and target those supports there. And they're trying to do that through counties and through these networks, both of which have potential, but some work and some don't. And so they really need to know which ones are working and which ones aren't, so that they can go in or send more resources in to get those going.
Can I just add that I think it's not just an issue of going in and providing additional support. There are many districts that are also experimenting with and doing some really important initiatives in early childhood education, both expanding using their own resources for early childhood education, but also connecting very productively with the community. I'm still getting an echo, so. I think the problem is not just that they need extra support, but most of those districts will give you a long list of all the ways in which the policies of the state actually interfere with their ability to be able to expand productively to include early childhood education.
Thank you for adding that in, Deborah. So we have another question for Dr. Santibanez. We've talked about we've talked in a couple of in the overview and in some of the statements about English learners, but could you give us a little bit more detail about this population and their unique challenges and opportunities in California?
Absolutely, Heather. English learners, also known as emerging bilingual students, are a really important population in California. Almost 40% of students that enter the school system in California are initially classified as English learners. So their needs have to be at the top of mind for teachers and districts. Our studies, my study as well as Ilana Mansky's studies on English learner, found some troubling results. For example, as Susanna mentioned early on, a lot of English learners are tracked into lower level content. They enter sometimes special education designations without very accurate knowledge of whether that's a precise designation. There are unclear criteria for exiting these designations. And although California is actually moving right now to a more unified reclassification system, It used to be the case up until very recently that districts varied widely in the criteria that they used to exit kids from English learner status. And so English learners are basically facing a double challenge. They have to learn content and language proficiency. And we found in our study that a lot of teachers are unfortunately unprepared to teach them. There have been some progress being made in terms of what teacher preparation programs are doing, but there's some weaknesses and much remains to be done.
Thank you so much, Lucrecia. This next question is for Dr. Imazeki as our resident finance expert. I'm going to read this question. It sounds like many of the findings point to the need for greater financial investment in public education. Did any of the papers explore tax reform or where these additional investments come from? Which needs should be prioritized first, since resource allocation often competes for the same resources? Jennifer, given the research that you did and have done over the years, how would your papers address that question?
Well, in the second half of my paper, I do look at kind of options for additional revenue, and in particular, sort of trying to look at what other states do. As I think most people realize, finance for schools in California looks quite different than in other states because of the restrictions of Prop 13. Most other states rely much more heavily on local property taxes than California does or can. So my paper kind of highlights a few of the other options. There's things like parcel taxes, local income taxes, other local taxes like sales taxes and such. The challenge with any of those, anything that to increase revenue locally has potential equity effects, right? So obviously sort of all of our school finance goes back to the 70s and concerns about inequities based on property values. And that hasn't changed, right? The reason that the state contributes so much to school finance is in order to make sure that places that have high property wealth don't automatically have more resources than those places that have lower property values. So, I mean, there's no easy answers, right? There's no easy way to raise additional revenue locally without the state also contributing in order to offset those inequities. And so there have to be, any conversations about raising additional revenue have to include where that revenue is going to come from at the state level as well. And that's a much bigger lift.
Thank you for that. We have a couple of questions about LCF implementation that I would like to direct to Dr. Marsh. So the questions really surround some of the statements that have been made about LCFF needing to want the local people wanting LCFF to stay the course, but also there being challenges around implementation and allocating resources in the context of actually increasing costs in other areas. So Julie, from your research in the LCFF Research Collaborative, how have you seen districts handling those challenges? And what are some good examples of local district finance allocation?
When you say those challenges, specifically?
Specifically around allocating resources to support targeted students, but also in the context of declining money.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things that comes out of the LCFF RC research and the paper and getting down to facts from Julie Kopich and Dan Humphrey is that we need more guidance from the state, particularly around appropriate use of some of these supplemental concentration funds, and particularly around differentiating supports and services for the target groups. That often what was found was when districts are reporting on how they're using the funds for particularly English learners and foster youth, it's often swept up in the low income category without a lot of distinction between how those services are targeting the specific needs of English learners and foster youth as opposed to just low income. And so, you know, it varies from district to district. I think our reports and our case studies have some examples of districts that have been very thoughtful in how they target services to each of these subgroups. I think the growing concern around challenges of inadequate base funding is creating some tension for districts on where to allocate the resources. And exactly what Corey was saying, in a lot of the research in these papers, also from the work on the CBOs, the number one concern is how special ed funding, how benefits and pensions, all of those costs are encroaching on their ability to use these funds then to support the target groups. And so it's a big concern. I don't know if we have the answer for how to address the challenge. I just would reiterate that it's a widespread, I mean, I think it was 78% of the superintendents said that inadequate base funding is a barrier to improving teaching and learning. And we heard it from almost every CBO that was interviewed on that other paper. So these things need to be addressed. I think we have examples. I think we have good examples also of districts that are being thoughtful about the local engagement of stakeholders. And I think our paper illustrates some of what we're calling these outlier districts that are very thoughtful about engaging traditionally underserved and marginalized communities in the process. But by and large, there are huge challenges around how you engage the target group, parents and guardians, for example. That was widely cited as a challenge for superintendents. And so again, I think this speaks to the capacity needs of greater guidance, greater examples of how to do this, and more investment of resources in building capacity, not just with the districts, but also in the local communities. If we're talking about local control, then we also need to build the kind of political capital, the skills and knowledge of the communities to participate as well. And we should pay attention also to these intermediary organizations and community-based organizations that are playing a large part in some of these places that are doing meaningful engagement.
Thank you so much.
Heather, I'd like to add that I've only been in California for 14 years, but I'm very struck by the fact that most of these education policy discussions take place almost in an echo chamber. We try to study comparisons between school districts or county offices here within California, but there are lessons outside of California also. What we should be asking, in addition to why can't my district be better than some other district in California, we should be asking why California can't be better than Georgia, better than Kentucky, better than Texas. Why can't it be better than dozens and dozens of states that outperform California? That's it.
Thank you. I think this question is best addressed to Dr. Loeb, since we don't have an expert in this area on the line. The question is about what our set of studies found about charter schools and the effect that they're having or areas that they might need to improve.
Thank you, Heather. So we did not do a new study of the current effectiveness of charter schools. So because we weren't able to get more current data on student achievement, instead we relied on the 2014 study of how charter schools are doing in the state for that particular question. But actually there it looks quite good. So particularly for charter schools that are serving urban students and who are serving students, student groups who often do less well academically, these groups tend to perform better in charter schools than a matched group of students in their local public schools in a pretty convincing causal study. So the charter schools don't look better for everybody, but for this group of students, the least well-served students in the public schools, the charter schools look quite effective. The new work that we did was to look at which charter schools closed and also look at the oversight of charter schools. And what we found on a positive note too is that on average, the charter schools where students are learning less tend to close more, which is how you would want it to be. And that's at least as true in California as in other states. If anything, we seem to do better at at keeping open our better schools and closing our less effective schools. This said, we have a very, very decentralized system of authorizing charters. As you probably know, each district is essentially an authorizer, and most authorizers only authorize a couple of schools, and the amount of extra resources that they get for overseeing those schools is very small relative to other states. And so we may not have the kind of oversight capacity that some of the other states do. So just as a little summary of that, our charter schools seem to be doing okay, but there is reason to think that we could build more capacity for oversight and that other states have done a better job of doing that.
Thank you, Susanna. Now I'm going to give you the last word, Susanna, to answer a question that was posed here at the beginning, and then we'll sign off. How do you see these studies being used? What do you hope to happen as a result of these studies?
Oh, thank you. What a great question. So we really hoped that the studies would provide information to make a much richer debate so that we could have much better policies that really went after the things that we haven't gone after as well as we should, so that really went after achievement gaps in particular, went after early childhood education, went after pensions and other issues in finance, and even go after the low funding level overall, so that we don't make really very specific recommendations, because there are lots of different details in how we could implement these things. We really aim to provide a base so that the discussions would be richer and more effective.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the folks who attended today's webinar. We really appreciate your time. We hope this was useful. Please go check out our website at gettingdowntofacts.com. You'll see all 36 studies, all 19 research briefs. We have videos there, snapshot documents, and of course, this overview paper that Susanna provided the overview of in today's lesson that was co-authored by Dr. Edley, Dr. Imazeki, and Dr. Stipek. And of course, please let me or us know if you have any questions about the studies. Thank you all for joining.